The lost world sees Christianity through its rules, and what that demands is that apologetics needs to demonstrate that Christian truth is winsome because it explains who we are and how we can flourish as creatures in this life and beyond if we are reconciled to our Creator. Believers need to be ready to answer the difficult questions that the world will throw at them. The problem of evil is one such very difficult question. Over the coming weeks, we're going to attempt to build, as I said, a systematic view of this problem, which will introduce our church and you to a number of subjects, including, but not limited to, tonight we're going to be looking at natural evil. Next week, moral evil. We're going to be looking at absolute truth, miracles, and evil as evidence for God. And my hope is that we come away with a better ability to critically think about what we believe and more prepared to answer biblical questions. Okay? So that's the framework of Christian apologetics. And you don't have to be a genius to do it. I am the poster child for that. I'm not a genius. I am learning every day, learning how to think through the difficult questions. And that's what I want our church to do, because if we do, when we give the gospel, when we do evangelism, we're going to be even more prepared for those tough questions. And the tough questions do come. They do come. In fact, Dwayne was telling me about a conversation he had this week. Was it this week? And it goes right in line with what we're going to be studying. And so this is why we need to go through these things. All right, so we've looked at Christian apologetics. Any questions thus far? All right. Let's look at what the problem of evil is. And David did a really good job. Hey, fantastic doing the notices. I think you got a new job. You built that up so well, I didn't know what was coming. And but let's look at the problem of evil. I went too fast. The problem of evil is a question that has plagued theologians and apologists and philosophers for many centuries. There is a modern day atheist philosopher named William Rowe, and he is an active proponent against the existence of God. He's a professor of philosophy at Purdue University and is very well known for his argumentation that evil proves that God does not exist. Here's a sample of what he states. He says, the problem of evil is the problem of understanding why there is so much evil in the world if the world is created by and under the providential care of a being who is infinitely powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. He says, for if God is all-knowing and infinitely powerful, he certainly could have prevented many, if not all, of the terrible evils that afflict our world. And being infinitely good, he would surely want to prevent such evils. But then why is there so much horrendous evil in our world? This is what he says. He actually puts it in another way into three statements. And let's examine these just for a moment. He says, okay, there exists instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So he is making this comparison between, you say, Christian, that there is this omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful being who could prevent these things, and yet these things of evil exist. So what is your answer for that? He carries on and he says, an omniscient, holy, good being would prevent the occurrences of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So he's saying, you say you believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing God, but there is evil. And he says, if there is an omniscient, all-powerful God, he wouldn't let these things happen. So he says, therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. So in his mind, he examines the facts that you say this is what God is, but evil exists. I don't believe your God exists. Understand? We could put it in very simple terms. If God is real, there would be no evil in our world. Evil exists, therefore God does not. Okay? Now, sounds like he's making a strong argument. But we're going to take 7 weeks and look at how we can unravel this argument. And we're going to address some of that this evening. There's another Christian author who wrote a really good systematic theology book called Christian Theology named Millard Erickson. And he states that the problem of evil may be thought of as a conflict involving three concepts. It attacks God's power, it attacks God's goodness, and it reveals and opens our eyes to the evil in the world. So here is the problem of evil. If God is all powerful, if he is all good, if he is all knowing, then why in the world does evil exist? And what possible purpose could it serve? That's a good question, isn't it? Thank you, David. I want us to think about that. Do you know that people who don't know the Lord ask fantastic questions? They have a lot of good questions. And we need to be ready to hear them without being offended, without getting our I don't know what the British way to say it is, backs up. And we need to be ready with an answer, right? So that's why we're looking at this. So we've looked at what Christian apologetics is, and we've looked at the problem of evil. Any questions thus far? I want to make sure you're with me at all times. I don't want to lose anyone. Okay? Any questions? Anyone at home? By the way, if you're on Zoom and you have a question while you're typing it out, just do the hand symbol, and we'll know that you're writing. Okay? Next thing we want to look at is, so as we, over the many weeks we're going to go through this, we're going to build a systematic thought. But even tonight, we're building one step upon the other. I want us to look for a moment at the origins of evil. How would we define evil? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Sam? Yeah, if you think bad things about somebody, that is a sin. That's an evil. But what is evil by definition? Sorry? The opposite of God's goodness? Going against God's character, the opposite of God's character, right? Right? In a way, sin and evil kind of share the same description. You might say that we could talk about moral evil this way, that evil is the occurrence of bad or negative states of affairs due to wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Now, free-willed moral agents is one of those top shelf explanations. That just means us, okay? Us. We are free-willed moral agents, okay? And we go against God. We do sinful things. Now, I told Ashley I wasn't going to say this tonight, but it just popped in my head again, and I'm just going to say it. Though Adam and Eve brought sin into the world, Adam brought sin into the creation. Sin already existed in Satan. Satan had rebelled against God, and so there's a greater thought there. But evil is simply going against the rules and laws and character of God. If you really look at anything that's evil, you can track it all the way back to sin, to the product of sin. this book here, there's a big book there called Christian Apologetics. If you are interested at all in delving into the world of apologetics, that is a fantastic book. And the guy's name is hard to pronounce, hard to forget. His name is Douglas Gruthis. How'd you like to have that? Gruthis. But he says, the vexing question of the origins of evil, the vexing question has no simple answer, though this hardly stops us from recognizing evils. Evil frustrates human goods, as well as goods benefiting the non-human world. And he's talking about animals and larger environment. The avoidable suffering of both man and beast is evil. Even deforestation, he says, can be evil. Evil comes in a plethora of types and instances, many different ways. But the field divides into basically two categories: natural evil, which we're going to talk about tonight, and human or moral evil that we're going to be talking about next week. So in order for us to truly think about evil and its origins, we need to make three considerations. To be reminded of three considerations from Scripture, and you see that on your page. The first consideration is we need to think about creation. Now, many of us are familiar with the creation account. We have read it, we have taught it to children, but we understand that God created man and woman in his image and in likeness and declared that they were good. He gave Adam and Eve rule over all creation. They were to care for it, develop it, and manage it. Within creation, though, there are three important points that stand out. I just want to walk you through this just to kind of set the scene. The universe and humans are objectively valuable to God. We talked about this a couple of Sunday nights ago. They're valuable because God created them and declared them good. The universe has a structure and a purpose, since it was created by and is sustained by a personal and moral God. God gave humans moral responsibility, and he instructed them on how to live. In the beginning, the road to life was broad, and the road to death was narrow. Don't eat of this tree, and you'll be all right. But did they do that? And thus, by Adam and Eve partaking of the tree and disobeying God, they brought the effects of sin upon the world that God had created, the perfect world that God had created, and into the life and lineage of all humanity. And that leads us to the second thing. We have to examine and be reminded of the fall. Genesis 3. Now, there is no other explanation that exists that better explains what happened to humanity and why evil exists and why sin plagues all of humanity than the fall. I mean, this is a bedrock theological and doctrinal thing, that God created us good. He said, don't eat of the tree. Our father Adam ate of the tree, sinned, was cast out of the garden, and then the relationship between man and God was broken, in need of restoration, and thus we are still living with the ramifications of that sin, of that evil that Adam brought upon us all. Now, this next slide, I don't want it to overwhelm you. There's a lot of text on there, but I want us to walk through, and I added this because I think it's important to look at each one of these statements. All right, now let me read this for you. Number one, Christianity claims that vice and natural evil are not intrinsic, they're not original with us or necessitated by human nature or the universe. That's not the way God created us. He didn't create us to be naturally evil. We had an inclination to sin, and we did, but that's not the way we were created. Evil was not built into creation by God. He didn't on the eighth day create evil. Okay? Our first parents rebelled against the known law of God and thus fell, right? We see this on the pages of Scripture. This was not on account of God misleading them, though the serpent did, or of God coercing them. They deliberated and acted against God. They deliberately acted against God and his instructions. Nor was the fall due to their own finitude. Creatures, what I mean by that is creatures are finite by God's good design, and the unfallen angels remain finite and sinless. What I mean by this is God created angels who are eternal, okay? And God created us who in our mortal bodies are not eternal. Our spirit will live on in heaven or eternally in hell. So we didn't sin and we didn't fall just because of our physical nature, right? Just because we're human beings, that didn't mean that we're the only kind of being that could fall. Why? Because Lucifer fell, and he was created as a different kind of being. That's all this first statement is saying. But God did not directly cause or create evil in the same way he created the universe. Secondly, the discontinuity between original and fallen humanity means that humanity, as it now stands, has hope for recovery. Even though we fell, even though we sinned, that isn't the end, okay? That isn't the end. That's not all that God has for us. If the abnormality that results in moral and natural evil is rooted in the fall, so if evil that we talk about all the time, sin is rooted in the fall, then we have a basis for opposing all manner of evils without opposing God himself. So, because God is not the author of evil, and though we did evil by sinning, we are not trapped by that. We can and should respond by rejecting sin and embracing Christ and restoring the relationship to God the Father through Christ. We are all damaged goods, and that needs radical repair. You see where we're talking about here is that some people will say that evil exists because God is somehow evil. And if he were good and just and holy and righteous, he would never have let evil into the world. Have you ever asked yourself, why did God put that tree in the garden? Why? I think in some ways it was to give us a choice. I think I don't want to go down too far this road because we could have a whole night about this, but I think God designed us the way he did, and he put that tree there because he didn't create automatons. He didn't create robots, right? If someone loves you because there's no option for anything else, is it truly love? No. In God's grand design, he has far more reaching plans than what we can discuss tonight. But it was all in God's providential plan that tree be there. He knew before he created us that we would sin and fall away from him. And before all created time, he knew that he had a plan for our redemption. All right, let's move on because there's many other things to talk about. That leads us into this idea of redemption. When we think about redemption, we see creation, we see the fall, and we see redemption, the plan of redemption, before we even get out of Genesis 3. It's all there. We see two things from Genesis 3:15 and 16. Number one, we see that this is the work of God to redeem and restore the fallen world back to himself. God promised Adam and Eve that this redemption would come from the seed of woman. Secondly, we see God revealing himself all throughout history through creation, prophets, and then at last reveals Christ, the promised Messiah, and promised means of redemption. Why in the world do we bring this up in a discussion about natural evil? Well, we're going somewhere. But we need to understand that, and we'll see this as we track through these studies, that evil has a purpose. And though it does not originate from God, God cannot do evil, he does have a purpose for evil. There would be no redemptive plan. There would be no Christ on the cross without evil, without sin entering into the world. That didn't happen. It didn't catch God off guard, but it's all part of his overall plan. Before we go to the next section, any questions? comments? Everybody take a breath. Yeah, I would say, and you have to forgive my memory, basically to know good and to do it not, it is sin. The definition of sin, I think, is the definition of evil as well. Yeah, I think it's one and the same. It's one and the same. Now, the world is not going to call it sin because they don't like that word, but they will say evil. But evil is a product of sin. Thank you. Isaiah 5:20. Thank you very much. Everybody, we're all tracking so far, right? Okay, now we're going to get to the crux of this evening. We're going to talk about natural evil. Now, here's this lovely name again, Douglas Gruthis. He describes natural evil is the natural world turned savage, meaning tornadoes, earthquakes, tidal waves, hurricanes, floods. Diseases and deformities fill out this category since they are not usually instigated by humans. This includes both deadly diseases as well as disabling diseases. When we think about natural evil, we think about it in the context of not created by a flawed moral agent, us. It is the suffering that results from natural disturbances. This type of evil comes from the natural flow of creation post-fall. Again, Erickson says that natural evil does not involve human willingness, any human willing and acting, but is merely an aspect of nature that seems to work against human welfare itself. Lightning hits a striker, lightning strikes a hiker and kills him. A woman is bitten by a poisonous snake and dies from her wounds. A family home washes away in a mudslide, killing all the residents. These are examples of the events of nature producing evil outcomes. There's a man named Gary DeWeese states that these three conditions must be present in order to claim an act of event that falls into the category of natural evil. Let's look at that briefly. So if it's a natural evil occurrence, it has to, he says it has to follow in this category. The event causes serious physical or mental injury to a sentient creature, resulting in severe pain or death. Number two, it is not caused directly by a human being, a moral agent. And it is not a case of useful pain, that is, pain which a positive indicator to a sentient creature, a human being, of a possibly harmful condition. And what does that? What does 3 mean? You touch your hand on the stove, it burns, it's hot. It says don't. It tells you don't touch it. Okay, that's a useful pain. That's not a natural evil, right? You know, there's a lot of things that we could talk about that are natural things. A smell, a touch, a noise that tells you something is dangerous. And though it might be painful, it might be a hard lesson to learn, that's not a natural evil. That's a useful pain, as it would be defined. So we're talking about natural events. If a human caused it, it's not a natural evil. Okay? Next week is going to be, we're going to call it a moral evil. So we're going to talk about moral evil next week. Great question, Jeff. Let me tell you, it was hard to split this line, but there's a reason we're talking about natural evil this week and then moral evil next week, because moral evil is going to help us get down the process of this whole thought. Deweese also would say that animal suffering is part of this. Okay, now not animal suffering, a poor animal being hit by a motor vehicle, that's caused by a human. But what these definitions do is they perfectly lead us into, you remember William Rowe I mentioned earlier, the atheist philosopher who is anti-God and says there's evil, so there's no God. He's famous for giving two examples, one of natural evil and one of moral evil. We'll look at that one next week. But he's famous of giving an example of natural evil using a fawn. Oh, isn't that the cutest thing we've seen? A little fawn on the screen there. He says he said this is an example of natural evil that is hard for him to understand. He says a fawn, he says there's a lightning strike in a forest. The lightning catches a tree on fire. The forest goes ablaze. A fawn gets trapped in the forest. He catches fire and he suffers burns and lies there for many, many days on the forest floor before death relieves its suffering. Pretty sad picture, right? It's often difficult to think about something like that and see what purpose could that possibly have. What natural evil, what purpose could natural evil serve in the view of an all-powerful, all-caring, all-knowing God, right? Kind of a strong statement, strong argument on the face of it. Hold that thought, because in just a moment, we're going to look at some responses or a response to that kind of thinking. And I'll just say just a little blurb. Most strong or seemingly strong attacks of any kind, especially when it's theological attacks or it's God can't exist if evil exists, they normally have a glaring, something glaring that they leave out, that they don't want you to consider, that is really the Achilles heel of their argument. Okay, so we're going to look at that in just a moment. Now, the next thing, any questions thus far? So we understand what natural evil is. Okay. Now, I had to use this word theodicies because that's what the word is, a theodicy for natural evil. What is a theodicy? A theodicy is basically a solution. It is to provide the vindication of divine providence in the view of the existence of evil. So we've had this claim, if evil exists, then an all-knowing, all-powerful God cannot exist. So then all throughout the history of theology, people have offered a response. No. Here's the response to that question. I'm just going to mention a couple to you tonight. One that's not so strong and one that sounds a bit better. And I just want us to be able to begin to think about, because that's what I want us to come up with in this next week, to be thinking about, how would I answer the question of natural evil with my friends, family, coworkers? All right? Now, many theologians and philosophers have produced their own theodicies, their own solutions over the years. In fact, faced with natural evil, many scholars, even Charles Darwin, offered solutions. One of his compatriots, Cornelius Hunter, said, here's his solution. And sorry for my misspelling. Many solutions or theodicies for the problem of evil hold that evil arose from the autonomy that God granted to his own creation. God installed natural laws between himself and creation. And evil was somehow an unfortunate byproduct of the workings of those natural laws. God is distanced from creation and is therefore absolved of its evil. The problem of evil could be solved with careful explanations of how God relinquished control of creation. What's wrong with that statement? Which means, if God is not in control, he is not God. Now we talked about that at length many, many weeks ago. Nice try, Cornelius, but you don't end up with God. What Cornelius and what Charles Darwin were trying to do with their theodicies was trying to cut God completely out of the picture. to absolve God. Well, it's really not his fault. Here's a different interpretation, different things. They attempted to derive a mechanical solution that invoked natural laws and absolve God of responsibility for nature's inequity. The solution would have nature driven solely by natural law. Now, natural law is, think about how the world works, gravity, okay? This morning I spoke of a miracle is that which breaks natural law. And the only one who can break natural law and create a miracle is God himself. Why? Because he is the creator of the natural law. Do you know why we don't get flung off the earth into space? Because God created gravity. And the origins of scientific exploration were not to tear down God, but they were meant to explain why God and how God worked. And very quickly it splintered off. And so when we say natural law, that the world is driven by natural law and that God is not, we're saying that God created the earth and then he let it roll as it may. And he's gone on to do something else. Cornelius's solution, Darwin's solution, has its roots in deism. Now, deism is the belief in a God who made the world, but who never interrupts its operations with supernatural events. What's wrong with deism? There's one massively glaring problem in that statement. Maybe more, but one I'm thinking of. Absolutely. So is a deistic or a deism view, a deistic view of the Bible and of God, is that the God of the Bible? No, it cannot be. You can't believe in deism and the God of the Bible at the same time. They work against themselves. So too, if we say God created the world, let it go, and he walks away, that is not the God of the Bible at all. And though it sounds nice and it might have sounded as a good solution, it is not a good solution at all. Essentially, God created everything, as they would say, and set it in motion, but he no longer involved himself in creation. So evil is a natural byproduct of the evolution God set in motion, and he is therefore not responsible for its outcome. Now, there is a Christian apologist named Alvin. It looks like planting a, but it's plantinga, okay? Before I read his view of divine constraint, I want to say this. So we said deism, and this is not in your notes. The biblical view of the God of the Bible is called Christian theism, that God does interact with his creation through miracles, okay? We're going to be looking for an entire night at Christian theism in a few weeks, and I'm really excited about that. So be here for that discussion. Now, Alvin is a leading Orthodox Protestant philosopher, and he's well known for his view of divine constraint. And he says this: a world containing creatures who are significantly free, which means they're freely to be able to perform more good than evil actions, is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all. They do not do what is right freely. These creatures, to create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. As it turned out, sadly enough, some of the free creatures God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil that we're going to be discussing more next week. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness. For he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil by removing the possibility of moral good. Now let's unpack that just for a minute. And I want you to understand that for this divine constraint, it has to be enveloped by the sovereignty of God. And we understand that we do have a measure of free will. God allows us to exercise, if I want to pick up this cup, if I want to do this, but nothing is exercised outside of his will and his control. But what he's saying is that essentially God created Adam and Eve. He created them good, but he also created them with the ability to make a choice. Otherwise, he would not have said, "Don't eat of that tree." If they didn't have any choice, it would kind of be a moot point. But he created them good. He created them with an ability to choose to do good or choose to do evil. And they chose to do evil, as we all choose to do. And not only have we inherited our sin nature from Adam, but we freely participated in it as well. What he's saying here is that we are to blame for the evil and the sin that we brought into the world. And that though God created us and gave us the ability to choose, he nevertheless is not guilty of evil. Why is that important that God cannot be guilty of evil? Yeah, he would be corrupt. He would be sinful, and then he wouldn't be God, right? We could spend a lot of time picking this apart and find some things that we like, maybe find a few things we don't like. But it's on a better trajectory of understanding and laying some foundation for what we're going to be talking about in the future, okay? But we have to maintain, as we think about evil, that God has a purpose for evil. God is not evil in any way, and God is not evil in any way, and he has a purpose for evil. And we're going to be looking at that because we need to be able to provide an answer, right? Now let me tell you how this really, meets the road, especially next week as we begin to look at moral evil. People might ask you, why did my baby die from cancer? Where is God in that? It's a really tough question. And it's hard for me to almost say it because I immediately think about situations that have been close to that in my life. That's a tough question. And you know what we're learning tonight is not what needs to be said in that moment. What needs to be said in that moment is, I don't know, but God knows, and I love you, and I'm going to help you get through this, and I'm going to be here for you, I'm going to bring you a meal, and I'm going to be present. And then maybe one day that person will be ready to hear and talk about more, and you'll have an answer. And you'll be able to say that God is sovereign. He has a purpose. That I believe that child is with God as we speak. Those kind of answers, right? Never let what we learn intellectually be enough. It's good to know these things, but it's terrible if we use them and present them with no heart, with no emotion, with no compassion. We're not learning this stuff. We're not digging into this stuff to simply be able to offload information. This morning in the evangelism meeting, sometimes we think about evangelism as we just want to get it over with. And the author, J. Max Stiles, who I got to listen to this week, he said evangelism for most Christians is like this. We're a train, we're a locomotive, and we're building up steam. We just explode the gospel on somebody. We say, sorry about that. See you later. And it's done. It's over. I've done what God told me to do. I can move on with my life, right? That's not evangelism. That's trying to tick a box. The same is true with Christian apologetics. If we just try to offload information with no compassion, no love, no genuineness, no mercy and grace, then we're not doing anybody any favors. But I want this to be in the background as we answer these tough questions, as we think about these tough questions, because that's where the rubber meets the road, you know? When my mother died of brain cancer far too young, these questions rattled around like, why is this necessary? Why is this necessary? And then I remembered that God is in control. He is sovereign. He knew my mother before she was born. He knew exactly when she would pass away. He knew that she would be with him in glory. And that softened the blow, right? So I don't want us to just learn these things in order that we can win an argument or win a fight, but we need to move forward with compassion and love as we share these things. Before we go to the conclusion, is there any questions or comments about what we've learned thus far? If you have questions, if you have comments, if I said something that you didn't understand or you'd like it to be fleshed out a bit more, please call me, please email me. If you stay in that state where you don't know and you're frustrated, that's not where I want you to be, okay? But any questions or comments? Right. Yeah, the question is for those at Zoom is the question the problem of evil being asked because there's a desire to put man above everything? And I think to a certain extent there is. I think in that question there is, I don't want to believe in a God like that, but they don't understand the God of the Bible, right? And they need to hear all the things about God. It could be that they've had a traumatic experience and they just say, I can't believe in a God who would allow that to happen. That's a real hurt. I understand where they're coming from, and I do want to love on them, and I do want to help them to understand that God is greater than those difficulties, right? And we need to be prepared for an answer. But I think that's one thought, Jeff, is that we want to be on top. We don't want to be subservient to anybody else, right? And that's a good lead into our conclusion tonight. Think about the font. You remember how I said that a lot of these arguments are only one side of the coin? And they don't want you to examine the other side of the coin because then that hurts their argument. And we need to be careful that when we give our defense for the gospel, that we are also understanding of the other side of the coin so we can be better prepared to answer. But we think of this poor, young, beautiful fawn that dies an agonizing death for 5 days in a forest fire. What purpose is there in that natural evil? Well, what is the glaring thing that summation leaves out? So what is William Rowe not thinking about when he only focuses on that one fawn? What do you think? Yeah, Sue says all the ones that survived. Think about it like this. If we're going to blame God for that natural evil, we must also celebrate God for all the millions of fawns that didn't suffer that way on that particular day, or the dozens that didn't die that particular day in the forest. And when we bring up that for instance, it changes it has to change our view of God. Okay? And the reason I say that is because there's more to that story than just the fawn dying in that natural forest fire. Okay? And the ultimate reason for that forest fire, for that fawn's death, goes all the way back to sin. Right? It goes all the way back to sin. And when we are just limited on and focusing on that instance, we forget the glory and greatness and provision of God. Oftentimes when a tragedy happens, we'll focus on, and rightly so to a certain extent, we'll focus on all the death, but we won't focus on who all survived. We will be angry with God and we'll blame God for the death, but we don't rejoice in God for those who survived. And it's because I believe, to Jeff's point, that we're frustrated, that we could be frustrated by that. and angry by that because we want God to fit into our sense of morality. We want God to fit into our sense of truth. And we're unwilling sometimes to think about the other side of the coin, right? And if someone were to bring this up, that's the thing it's not necessarily an answer, but it's something to dialogue with. What about all the fawns that didn't die? You know, does God not get credit for protection of those? You know, can God stop everything from happening? Yes. Does he? No. But we have no idea what he's kept from us. And why do we who are Christians deal with a tragedy differently than someone who doesn't know about God? Or we would tend to not blame God, but trust in him, and the lost world will tend to blame God. The difference is that we know God, the God of the Bible, and that we know how he operates. We know how he's in control. Maybe we don't know it fully, but we have that basis. And what really people are doing is they're responding to what they don't know about God, and they're looking for somebody to blame. One time, I wasn't there, but Justin from Welling was out on the high street, and this big, bulky guy comes up, and Justin's got his evangelism t-shirt on. He says, hey, man, can I ask you a question about Jesus? And this guy just unloads on him. I mean, expletives, and he's like angry and spitting. And Justin's like, well, this is the end. You know, I've lived long enough. He's about to kill me, you know. And when he got done, Justin said, as we always trained our people to do, man, that's a really interesting way to think about Jesus. And they began to talk, and they began to share. You know why he was so angry? His dad had just died, and he was angry. And he left that conversation cool, calm, and collected, not coming to Christ, but knowing that some guy who claimed to know Christ was kind to him and listened to him and didn't get in an argument with him. I think the world is looking for something to blame. I was in a conversation one time with a guy, the older gentleman. We were sitting in the coffee shop. He came to sit beside me. It was kind of a weird experience, but it was a God kind of ordained moment. And he began to tell me, because after I told him I was a Christian and we were doing some stuff on the high street and I was taking a break, and he said, oh, I don't believe God. There is no God. And he just went on and on and on and on. I said, well, you know, we were talking back and forth. And then the conversation switched, and he began to blame God for everything. And he went on like this for 5-10 minutes. And I said, can I just say one thing? You cannot both deny God exists and then blame him for everything. Right? And he goes, yeah, I guess you're right. I said, you're riding the fence. And I said, I would love for you to come to a full knowledge of God the Father through Christ. But he was blaming God for everything at the same time, not believing in God. And that's the idea that we're dealing with a lot of times, is that they're looking for someone to blame. Why? Because there's probably some kind of trauma or hurt in their life. And if we're just trying to download information, if we're just trying to tick a box by sharing the gospel, you know what we miss? We miss an opportunity to show the love of Jesus Christ to someone who's hurting, right? And we don't need to miss that opportunity. Second concluding question, we're going to finish really quickly. Why do atheists care so much about evil? Why is this even a question? And the reason I ask this is that evil, as in bad things happen, as in animals die horrific deaths because of lightning and fires, evil is a natural byproduct of the evolutionary process. It's expected. It's demanded. So why is it a problem? Darwin states in his autobiography, suffering is quite comparable with the belief in natural selection, which is not perfect in its action, but tends only to render each species as successful as possible in the battle for life with other species. In wonderfully complex and changing circumstances, the abundant presence of suffering agrees well with the view that all organic beings have been developed through variation and natural selection. I mean, he celebrates evil, natural evil, right? So why is there a problem with evil? Because there's a problem with the created and the creator. That's truly the reason that there's a problem with evil, is because we can't line what we see with a God that we barely know or don't know. And so we rail against that figure, not knowing that he is the God of the universe and creator. He is the savior of the world, ready and willing to save us from the evils of the world. That's why there's a problem of evil. And we see it very simply tonight in one instance as we look at natural evil. Any questions before we close? And as you're thinking of a possible question, I just want you to be thinking over the next days, how would you respond to natural evil? If somebody asks you a question, how would you respond to the question of the problem of evil as it pertains to natural evil? Now, granted, we're going to deal more in life with the answer to moral evil, but this is where we begin. Dear Lord, we thank you so much that you are the God of the universe, that you have every answer that we need. You've given us your word. May we be students of the word, but may we also be compassionate as you were compassionate to us. May we be gracious and merciful as you were to us. May we be loving as you were to us. May we take this information that we're learning and use it for your glory. May we use it to extend our conversations. May we use it to lead people to Jesus Christ. The problem of evil is prevalent and is here, and the answer is Jesus Christ. God, go with us now as we have coffees and teas, and later as we leave this place, and remind us each and every moment that out there is our mission field, and let us be prepared to meet the task and the issues that may face us, but never in our own strength, always in the strength of the Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.